You know, I don't generally talk about, and I'm not going to tonight, about current affairs. But at the same time, there is a lot of talk because of a lot of things that are occurring in our nation about how to solve our nation's problems. It's always been my belief that the biggest issue that we have is that everyone ignores the obvious and looks at things because they are things that are much more dramatic, much more spectacular. So every time that we have any problem arise in our country, whether we're talking about the question of the number of children that are on welfare, or the number of families that have no one in the home who is actually working outside the home, or whether we're talking about the murder of policemen, as we've seen again today, the question always comes up, and people begin to discuss what are the answers. Well, I'm not a politician, and I don't believe the answers are found through a political process. I don't believe that that's possible. I believe that the problem is one that is much deeper than that. I was really listening to a speech made today by the sheriff of the county down where we had the murders today occur. And he said, and I don't really care what your views are about gun control, doesn't make any difference. I'm just going to tell you what he said. He said he didn't believe it was so much a matter of gun control as it was a matter of the condition of the heart. And I believe he was right. The problem is that men simply don't know the truth, don't believe the truth, don't care about the truth, and consequently, they do whatever they please. Well, you know, it's like tonight we were talking about Elijah and the still small voice. Most of the time, we're not looking for a still small voice. Most of the time, we're not looking for what we would consider to be a minor solution to the problem. For example, if you're driving down the road or walking down the street and you see a piece, the whole street is just covered up with litter, and there's a piece just very easy, convenient for you to pick up and put in the trash can, you don't do it because you think, well, what's the point in doing that? Because all this other that's here, that it really is not going to have an impact. And I think that's kind of the way people feel about problems that exist in a nation. They don't seem to realize that, you know, there is something that you can do that would be very helpful. And the thing that you can do is to have an understanding of what the real problem is. And the real problem in our nation is that we have some homes that are just not based on truth. And that's a serious problem. Now, I don't care if you're talking about the juvenile delinquency problem, whether you're talking about the prison population, whether you're talking about the educational problems that exist in our schools, whatever you're talking about, if we change the climate in the homes of the people of the United States, we would change the nation. Now, sometimes people talk about a grassroots movement. And what they mean by that is that you do something that's seemingly very insignificant, but before long, because there's all these small, seemingly insignificant things that happen, then a much greater purpose is accomplished. So I want to talk a little bit about it tonight. Now, I know that, you know, we have, 30, 40 people here, and that's it, and it's not going to have any real impact, and I understand that. I understand that even if we could publish this in a much greater way, and I'm kind of thinking about making this a radio program, that'll get it a little broader. But I understand that really, for the most part, people are going to ignore it because they think, well, this really won't solve the problem. But it really does solve the problem. And I think you'll see what I'm saying as we go along. When you think about the home, place that children are raised, think about what you should learn there. What is it that you're going to learn in your home that's going to better our society? Now, I'm not talking here about spiritual values, really, in the sense of hear, believe, repent, confess, be baptized. I'm not talking about understanding the oneness of the church and the purity of the church and the doctrinal positions that we should occupy. I'm not even talking about any of that. I'm just talking about some things that are pretty simple, pretty basic, and these are things that come from God and His Word. And there's only one place that those things are going to be taught, and that's going to be in our homes, and that's it. And unless we teach those things, then we're not going to see a significant change in the things that are happening in our country. No matter how much money we throw at it, no matter how many laws we pass, we're not going to significantly change the culture in which we live unless we go back to the basic building block of society and we improve it. It's kind of like this. You know, you can go to town and you can buy yourself the most elaborate, expensive coffee pot that you can buy. And you can buy all the little doodads to do whatever you want to do. But if you go and buy a very inferior brand of coffee and put it in it, it's going to be pretty bad. And that's what's happening in our world today. That we don't seem to understand that really you've got to go back to the bottom line. You can't look at all this extravagant machinery that we think somehow is going to solve the problem, because it won't. You have to go back to a much more basic position than that. And you're going to have to go back to the home. What is it that the home teaches that children don't really learn anywhere else? Well, one of the things is this. One of the biggest problems that we have, societal problems that we have today, is a lack of respect for authority. Well, why do you think that's true? Where do you think that lack of respect for authority has come from? Where do you think people learn to respect authority and grow up with an understanding of how authority is necessary for an orderly society? Where do you think they learn that? Well, here's what God said. It goes back really to the Ten Commandments in the Old Testament. We're reading from the New. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Notice what is then said. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. Now think of what he said. And then he says, that it may be well with thee, and that thou mayest live long on the earth. Now you think about the point that he's making. The point that he's making is that respect for authority begins where? It begins at home, when you learn to respect the authority of your parents. I'm going to tell you right quick that if you go to a school system that has a delinquent child that ends up in some type of a corrective situation, then in almost every case, what you're going to find is that the parents have not insisted. I'm not saying they're bad people. They just not insisted that, you know what, I'm authoritative here and you're going to learn to listen to me, and authority is something that's going to be a part of your life. And what you find is that people, when they think that they're doing their child a favor by letting them grow up in this very soft environment where there's no authority and no respect for authority ever taught, and they think that somehow magically at some point that child is going to reach the point that they will suddenly say, okay, we're going to respect the police, we're going to respect the teachers, we're going to respect the person that governs our country. It's not going to happen, because they don't really understand the principle. Now, I know that is a basic, simple fact, but it is the truth. And the truth is that if you look at the difficulties that we're having and you trace it back, is that we really have gotten away from insisting that, hey, you know, there is a principle of authority that has to be respected, and it's going to begin when you're a very small child, and that's something that's going to be reinforced through your whole life until you get to be an adult. And when you get to be an adult, guess what? You're going to have some sense of what it means to respect authority. And that's really simple. And probably I don't see it happening in our nation in the next several years because of the general philosophies that we have in our world. But it is something that is absolutely essential. And I'll tell you something else. You're going to have to learn to respect the rights of other people. In a family, what is it that we need to teach above all else? Well, what you have to teach is that, you know, what is it that I hear some of you people say it from time to time about your children, and sometimes I've heard it actually said to your children. You know, you're not the only one who lives in this house. What's important to you may not be the most important thing going on here. There may be something more important than this. And someone else may be in a position that we're going to have to kind of defer to what's needed in their life, even though that you may not be so happy about that. Well, that's what Jesus had said in His example that He said in His life. And that's what Paul refers to as he talks about the life of Christ and how it should apply to us. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory. We cannot reach the point that we're insisting that everything is going to be done to suit us. And yet, that's exactly what we see today, isn't it? Exactly. What we see is that we have whole groups of people that insist that we want everything done to suit me. And I don't really care what effect it has on anyone else. He said, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. Now, if you go back to heaven, if you've got two small children in your house, and you got something so simple as they get in a fight over a toy that they're playing with, that's the time that you teach that principle. Sometimes you talk about it being sharing. But in effect, you're saying you're not the most important person here. And you have to learn that lesson. You have to learn that you're a part of the whole, but you're not the whole. But in our society, we have people who live like it doesn't matter. They live like, well, you know, I want mine, and I really don't care beyond that. Where do they learn that? Well, since you have a societal problem, it seems to me that it's pretty widespread, so it can't just be a freak thing where somebody just ignored what they've been taught. Must have a lot of people who are not being taught that, who are being taught the principle of you are the most important, and you need to demand, and you don't need to be interested in anyone else but your welfare. And it happens over and over and over again. And until we correct that, then the problem will not go away. And you look at the idea of wisdom. One of the things that's happened over the years is that we have gotten to the point that most people in our country really have no respect for the Word of God when you get right down to it. Now, they may claim some respect, but in reality, when you begin to talk with them, they don't even have any idea what it's talking about. And when you look in Proverbs 1, it's so interesting to see the connection that you have to understand that real wisdom comes from God. And when you look at people who are trying to teach philosophy classes and say that God doesn't exist and He's not real, and when you go to school and you're told we're going to teach morality, but it's not based upon anything other than just whatever we determine is right, then you've got a real problem. Now, this proverb says this. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, judgment, and equity. Did you notice that? Look at what he said there, and think of the problems that we're experiencing. To receive instruction of wisdom, justice, judgment, and equity. To give subtlety to the simple. To the young man, knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and will increase learning. A man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsels. To understand a proverb and the interpretation, the words of the wise and their dark sayings. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. But fools despise wisdom and instruction. And the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. My son, hear the instruction of thy father, and forsake not the law of thy mother. They shall be an ornament of grace unto thy head, and chains about thy neck. Now you think about what he's saying. When you look at folks, and they may or may not be faithful Christians, but they're guided by the general principles that God exists, and there are certain moral responsibilities that are upon us because God exists. And people who are raised in that environment, they are much different than people that are raised in a different environment. And most of the time when you see folks who are acting in the way that some of the actions that we see today, they tell you right quick that they really don't believe that real wisdom comes from God. They don't even believe that God has any part in the equation at all. And we're going to have to change that if we ever solve the problems. One of the things, too, that's important is to think about this. You know, one of the things we need to remember is that relationships are more valuable than things. And that's a big problem that we have in today's world. And I say relationships because here's the thing. You know, all of us have relationships with someone. And we have to understand how important and how valuable they are. Now, this passage is about the virtuous woman. I understand that. But it's talking about how valuable the relationship of a wife is to a husband. And I know that's only one relationship, but I'm using it as an illustration. He said, who can find a virtuous woman for a price as far above rubies? The heart of her husband does safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. Now you think about what he then says. You should do him good and not evil all the days of her life. But in our country, a lot of the problems that we have are because you have a person that there's no value of relationships at all. For example, I've said this before, and I don't draw back from it because it's a statistical fact. 95, now it used to be 92, but now it's 95% of the prison population in the United States comes from a home that does not have both biological parents in it. That's a fact. In other words, we don't value relationships. We don't. We don't value the relationships that God has instituted. We just act like they're not important. I would almost guarantee you that if you're in a position to handle children much, as they grow up to be teenagers and beyond, you can pretty quickly tell who comes from a stable, two-parent home of both natural parents and which ones don't in almost every case. Now, that's a problem. Sometimes it's unavoidable. I understand that. Sometimes you end up with situations that you can't avoid because someone acts irresponsibly or someone may die, and that's possible. But that's not what's happening here in most cases. What's happening here in most cases is that people have decided that we're going to do whatever we please, and we don't care about our relationship with our husband or wife. And by extension, though they won't admit it and would probably be insulted when I say this, we don't care about our children either. We don't care really what happens to them. We're going to do whatever we please. And that is a real problem. And the only way that that problem is ever going to be solved is going to be when God's Word has become that system and that standard that is respected. And I'll tell you something else that's important to realize. Sometimes we need to understand that difficulties are unavoidable. You know, life is not a bowl of cherries. That's just the way it is. And we know that to be true. But difficulties are not insurmountable. And now sometimes people have this idea that, you know, my life is bad and I just can't overcome it, and therefore they just become very rebellious. And they do many things in violation of the law and drug abuse and all kinds of things because they think, well, I can't overcome the problems I have. It seems to me that really the problem is kind of expressed by what Jesus said here about his apostles having some problem casting out demons, although I realize that's a different situation. But he said something that's really critical. He said, if you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, you shall say unto this mountain, remove hence to yonder place, and it shall be removed, and it shall remove. And nothing shall be impossible unto you. Why? Because chapter 19, verse 26 says, all things are, with man it may be impossible, but all things are possible with God. Too many times we look at things as if we're going to handle them ourselves. We're going to use some type of physical solution or human solution to the problem, and we're going to solve it, and we pretty quickly figure out that's not going to happen. And so then we just decide that it's an insurmountable problem. I just can't overcome it. I sometimes think that some of these murders that are taking place are people who have become so convinced that we have problems in society that can never be changed. They can never have any answer to them, and so they decide they just through with it. And they leave this world in a blaze of glory as they would perceive it. But they need to understand something. You know, difficulties are unavoidable. Everybody, one of the things that's interesting to me is the number of people that get mad at somebody and say, you don't understand. And what they're saying is that I have problems and you don't understand them, and therefore you don't need to talk about them. And you know, sometimes you might discover, if you were to begin to investigate, that those people that you think don't understand have bigger problems than you have. You know, just because a person goes through life and acts responsibly doesn't mean they have no problems and there's nothing that's tearing at their heart. I mean, I'm sure that there are people that worship God on a regular basis, that attend church services, that have had such difficult things in their life that, you know, their life's not a bowl of cherries, but they're going on. You know, problems in life are things that are there, but they're not unsurmountable. Doesn't mean you can always even solve them. You know, when you look at Paul's statement, I can do all things through Christ which strengtheneth me, he's not even talking about solving problems. He's talking about living with them. He's saying, you can't solve them all, but you can go on. And people need to understand that. And yet the only place that's ever going to be taught is in the home. If we don't teach that in the home, who is going to teach our children that? Who is it that's going to teach our children, our grandchildren, and others over which we have an influence, that principle? You know, one of the things, too, we need to learn is this. We need to learn to discuss our grievances with other people. You know, the Lord's church has always been kind of a marvelous thing to me to consider. Have you ever thought about the diversity? People are always talking about diversity. You ever talk about the diversity of the Lord's church? We're living here, and we have brothers and sisters in Christ, such as Pick in South Africa. Pick lives on about $200 or $300 a month. Lives in what we would consider to be a tool shed. Lives a pretty tough life. And yet, when he has conversations with Joe yesterday, he's telling Joe about he understands all the difficulty and the tough things in his life and how hard they've been to deal with. You know, sometimes you need to realize that we don't seem to understand that. Well, what's happened sometimes is that when people are very different, then they get mad at each other. And we don't like you because you are smarter than me, or you got more money than me, or you got a higher social position than me, and I don't like you because you're under me, and you can kind of see that in James chapter 2. You got all these problems. Seems to me that God, in His Word, says something that people need to pay attention to. He's talking specifically about if we have some difference with someone. We have a grievance against someone. Something doesn't suit us well. He says, therefore, if thou bring thy gift to the altar, and thou rememberest that thy brother hath aught against thee. Now this means that you believe that he feels hard at you for something. It's not saying that he sinned against you. It's that he feels that you've sinned against him. You need to leave thy gift before the altar and go thy way, and first be reconciled to thy brother, and then come and offer thy gift. Now in chapter 18 and verse 15, he goes up from the other point. And he says, if you believe that your brother has mistreated you, if your brother trespass against you, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. If thou shalt hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother. Now, if you look at society that we live in and the problems that are existing, and you kind of go back to the first murder that was ever committed that we have recorded, and that would be Adam and Eve's sons, Cain and Abel. And you look back, and why did Cain kill Abel? Because he had a grievance against him that was unjust, but it was a grievance against him. And rather than discuss the grievance that he had with him, he killed him. That's exactly what we see taking place today. You know, I watch a lot of a show that's called The First 48 and really enjoy it. I don't know why. It's kind of morbid. And what it is mostly is people that just get into it over sometimes very small things, and somebody kills the other person. But what's the problem? They've not been taught as a young child and on through their life that, you know what? You need to discuss your differences. You need to kind of deal with them. You don't need to just allow it to become something that overpowers you and you just go out and commit some grievous and heinous act. You don't need to do that. The 4th chapter of the book of Ephesians says something that's always I found to be very interesting. And I can tell you, if you pay attention to it, it's a great help in your life. Be ye angry and sin not. And then he said this, let not the sun go down upon your wrath. What's he telling you? He's telling you, you know what? You need to learn that when there's a problem, don't let it consume you. You need to deal with it. Who do you think is going to teach that? If parents don't teach their children that, if they don't teach their children, who is it that's going to teach them that? Well, evidently, many of the things I see in our nation today, no one's actually teaching them that. And one thing to remember is this. It's kind of an interesting thought. You know you're not always right. That is a hard thing for most of us to believe and understand, but it's so. You're not always right. Many times, you know, you act like you're right, you demand it, but the truth is that you're wrong. The wise man said this, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes. He that hearkeneth the counsel is wise. A fool's wrath is presently known. but a prudent man covereth shame. You know what he's saying? He's saying, you know what? A person who reacts to everything that happens because he believes is right and strikes out at someone is going to live to regret that. But if you sometimes you have that feeling come upon you, but you count, as you say, count to 10 or whatever it is, so that you stop and consider it, you might find out you weren't right in the first place. And a lot of the things that are transpiring in the world today kind of lead me to believe that people have decided I'm right and you're wrong and I don't care, and that's just the way it is, rather than stopping and saying, you know what? This person might have a point, and consider it. Now, let's think about some things. I want you to consider and to remember the value of proper instruction. What we are taught as a child shapes our future. There are 3 passages here, 2 from Proverbs, 1 from the book of Psalms. What we're taught as a child shapes our future. Now, you know, I'm not saying that when a child is taught in the home, they may grow up and may not obey the gospel. That may happen. I don't know. But generally speaking, most of the time when people are brought up in a home that's pretty stable, has some principles that we've been talking about, they end up being a pretty solid citizen in society, and they have a job, support themselves, and they're just kind of good folks to be around, and they're good, as we sometimes say, solid citizens. Now, that's a fact. Proverbs 29, in verse 14, the writer says this. You know, you have to be careful that, I said verse 14, but it's actually not. It's down there in verse 17, where it says, correct thy son, and he shall give thee rest. Yea, and he shall give delight unto his soul, in verse 17. Now, the point he's making is that it's going to determine his future. You know, if you raise up a child in a home and you don't teach any respect for authority, and you teach them to do whatever they please, and they don't have to respect the rights of anybody else, and they just are led to believe that they can just act in any way they want, then what do you think is going to happen? And what do you think is going to happen in future life when they get to be adults? You think their parents are going to grow up, as we say, to be proud and respect them? Think about what he's saying. Second point is one you're probably very familiar with, chapter 22 and verse 6. Chapter 22 and verse 6 says, train up a child in the way he should go when he is old and not depart from it. Generally speaking, and here we're talking in the sense of generalities, I understand. But we're also not talking so specifically about acceptance with God here. I'm just talking about generally a good member of society. You just look at homes, and you can almost tell it. If you look at a home where everybody in the home refuses to work, and they sell drugs and all kinds of things to support themselves, what you can expect is the next generation is going to do exactly the same thing. But if you look at a home where the family gets up and goes to work every day and has some respect for authority and kind of obeys the laws, you know what's going to happen? Their children are going to tend to do the same thing. And that's basically the point he's getting at. You know, we want to solve the problems of society. Well, if we do, we're going to have to learn that we can't decide that we're going to change big things. We're going to change little things. And it's going to take some time. You know, one other thing I want to say, and that's important, is this. We cannot trust anyone else with the responsibility of guiding our children. Now, you just cannot do that. You can't decide, well, you know, I'm going to turn over the shaping of my child's character to the government. That I'm not going to have anything to do with it. I'm going to send them to school. I'm going to send them to daycare as soon as they're able to go to a government daycare. And then I'm going to send them to preschool, and then I'm going to send them to school. And they're going to dictate and determine their character. And I'm going to have a hands-off approach. If you do, you may find that you will be disappointed. You know what's interesting? This psalm is one we've read many times. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain. It is vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows, for so he giveth his beloved sleep. Then he said, Lo, children are an heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. As heirs are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of the youth. Happy is the man that has his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but they shall speak with the enemies in the gate. And that passage has always intrigued me because of the word era. You ever done any been involved in the archery, shot a few arrows from a bow. It's a pretty difficult process. Pretty difficult process. To hit a mark with it requires a lot of effort, a lot of practice. It's a whole lot easier to shoot a gun. You can pick up a gun and you can give a few lessons and you can be pretty accurate. But with a bow and arrow, it's not that way at all. It takes a lot of effort. And I think that's really what's happening today is we have a lot of people who are not willing to put forth that effort. You know, when I watch the shows that I see on the First 48 and I see that here are people who commit murders and then they go to their homes and you see what's going on there, you see that, I mean, you don't have to be a genius to figure out that's a bad environment. And then you're not really surprised at the outcome. You know, I try not to have a hopeless attitude. It is my hope that one day that the people of our country will realize that unless we allow God to be a part of the equation, we cannot solve the problem. Now, that's just the way it is. And that's just no changing that. I mean, even our forefathers understood that. One nation under God. And when it stops being under God, then it stops being indivisible. And it stops having liberty and justice for all. Because unity and liberty and justice are based upon God's Word, not based upon man. Well, I don't know if that really accomplishes any good, but it's something I've had on my mind for a while. So at least I have an opportunity to say it, and hopefully it's been somewhat beneficial to those of us who are here. We're going to sing a song of encouragement. We've not had a first principle lesson, but I see all familiar faces. If you know and understand the plan of salvation, and you wish to be baptized for remission of sins, we certainly give you that encouragement to do so as together we stand as we sing.